Joining us to guide us through this conversation is Rona Bekker, who is a policy manager at the National Employers Association of South Africa. Rona, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and good morning to your listeners. Thank you very much for having me.
From your observation and your own data, are employers complying with this law?
Well, we have to distinguish, Clement, between, let's say, the employers of, more company employers and then the private employers of domestic workers. The majority of our membership are employers in the formal sector, so they're company employers. And we can say from our statistics and from assisting those employers that yes, they do comply with the COIDA Act, they do register with the compensation fund, and they are compliant when it comes to that. However, when it comes to private employers or individuals and domestic workers, we must say that we've seen an uptake, which is a very good indication and a very good sign. I think the fact that NEASA offers these services to these private employers and individuals has made quite the difference. But unfortunately, statistically, I can't give you a number of how many of these private individuals who are not companies have indeed registered with the compensation fund for their domestic workers and whether or not they are compliant.
What are the consequences of not complying and registering workers for this fund?
Well, depending on each case and what happens with the domestic worker, it can have dire consequences for that employer. If the domestic worker is injured or contracts a disease or even passes away, which is, if you recall, what happened, which led to the Constitutional Court, including domestic workers, into the COIDA Act, while performing his or her duties, if that employer is not registered with the compensation fund and not compliant, that employer will be held liable for all of the expenses that emanate from that injury, disease, or the death of the domestic worker. And that could financially be, that could ruin an employer.
Okay. One of the requirements is a valid work permit. How can employers encourage employees to make sure that their documents are in order if of course, if they are foreign nationals?
Yeah, from both sides, there is a responsibility upon the employer and the employee to ensure that all of their documentation is valid and correct. If an employer is unsure whether or not the work permit or the required permit from the foreign national, whether that's valid or not, NEASA does have a close standing relationship with an immigration specialist to whom we can refer that employer, and he can verify or check whether or not that permit is in order and valid.
Okay, and how much is that contribution that's required through this fund?
Okay, for every worker and every industry, that's going to be different. So we're focusing on the domestic workers, and their scale is 1.04% of the domestic workers' annual earnings. However, we know that there's a trend in South Africa where maybe you have a domestic worker that comes in once a month. She has multiple or he has multiple employers. So if that minimum, that 1.04% of the annual return of earnings is less than what they call the minimum assessment amount, which is currently 528, then the 528 Rand will apply. So if you, for instance, pay your domestic worker 250 Rand per day, just as an example, that runs up to 1,250 Rand a month if they only come once a week. The annual return of earnings is going to be, or the earnings is going to be 15,000 Rand per annum, and the 1.04% will be 156 Rand, which is very low. So you will pay the 528 Rand, which is the minimum assessment.
Oh, I see. And then with this fund, can it support those who can no longer work?
Yes. Well, that will depend, and they will adjudicate your case and give you an outcome. But if, for instance, you were injured or contracted a disease at the workplace and that is the reason for which you can no longer work, yes, then you will have a claim at the compensation fund.
Okay. So for domestic workers who want to check if they are registered with the fund, how do they go about doing that? Is it just a matter of checking with their employers, or should they be approaching the Labour Department?
Well, I would always think that best practice and based on the trust relationship that an employer and employee wants to build, specifically when it comes to domestic work where the employment relationship is so much closer to home, I would recommend that the employee inquire from the employer first and ask, have you registered with the compensation fund? If they do not get a satisfactory answer, yes, then they should most probably go to the online systems of the Compensation Fund or Department of Employment and Labour and try to inquire online. I would also advise, should they want to know, that they rather contact NEASA and let our expert service providers assist them with checking, because it can be quite difficult navigating the online systems of the Compensation Fund sometimes.
Yeah.